Early 1964. Brazil looked like a country that had split in two. The arguments had left the Congress chambers. They had left the editorial offices. They had left the boardrooms and the union halls. They were in the streets, in the schools, in the factories, in the churches, in kitchens, at dinner tables, between people who had once agreed on everything and now couldn't agree on anything. On one side, millions who believed deep structural change was overdue, that Brazil could not keep growing, while leaving half its people behind. On the other, millions who believed those same changes would destroy everything the country had built, that the left was not reforming Brazil. It was dismantling it. Between those two convictions, there was no longer any room for doubt and no room for each other. To understand what was happening in Brazil in 1964, you have to step back, far back, to the world as it existed then. The Cold War was not a metaphor. It was the organizing principle of global politics. Two superpowers, two visions of how the world should be ordered. And every country on Earth understood, or was made to understand, that had to choose. In 1959, Cuba had chosen a revolution that Washington had not seen coming, had placed a communist government. 90 miles from Florida, the Kennedy administration had tried to reverse it. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed spectacularly. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world within hours of nuclear war. By 1964, Washington was not going to let that happen again. Not in the Western Hemisphere. Not in the largest country in Latin America. Not in Brazil. The American government was watching Brazil carefully. The CIA had operatives in the country. American corporations with Brazilian investments were lobbying Washington. The U.S. Embassy in Rio de Janeiro filed detailed reports on Goulart's every move. President Lyndon Johnson's administration had already made its assessment. Goulart was a problem. His reforms were a threat. And if the Brazilian military moved against him, the United States would not stand in the way. In fact, it would help. Operation Brother Sam, an American naval task force positioned off the Brazilian coast, ready to provide fuel, ammunition, and support to whoever removed Goulart from power. Brazil's political crisis was never just Brazil's. On the streets of Brazil's cities, the argument had become physical, not violent, not yet, but embodied, present, impossible to ignore. On one side, the organized left was mobilizing with a discipline and energy it had never shown before. Labor unions coordinated strikes and marches. The peasant leagues in the Northeast organized demonstrations in cities that had never seen rural workers arrive in columns. Student groups operated on campuses and spilled into the streets around them. They were fighting for something, and they believed they were winning. And on the other side, something equally large was forming. Women's groups in middle-class neighborhoods who believed the family was under existential threat. Business associations who had watched Goulart's economic policies with growing alarm. Church leaders who saw in the left a threat to Christian values. Officers' wives who passed information between barracks and living rooms. These groups were not fringe. They were mainstream. They were millions. And they were organized. Two mobilizations. Two Brazils, each convinced the other, was marching toward catastrophe. On March 19, 1964, São Paulo stupid. The March of the Family with God for Freedom brought somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people into the streets. Estimates vary, but there is no dispute about the scale. It was the largest anti-government demonstration Brazil had seen in its history. The organizers said they were defending democracy, defending the family, defending Brazil from a government that was dragging it toward communism, and the military officers watching from their windows, and their barracks, and their carefully arranged meetings, looked at that crowd and understood something. If they moved against Goulart, They would not be alone. For Goulart and his allies, the march was a warning. The conservative opposition was not going to accept the basic reforms. It was not going to wait for the next election. It was ready to act. For the military officers who were already planning, the march was something more specific. It was permission, not legal permission, not constitutional permission, political permission, the kind that comes from seeing 500,000 people in the street and understanding that what you are about to do will not be called a coup. It will be called a revolution. While the streets were filling, something happened inside the armed forces that accelerated everything. In late March 1964, a group of Brazilian Navy enlisted men staged what became known as the Sailors' Rebellion. They gathered without authorization. They defied direct orders. They demanded better conditions, the right to vote, and changes to the rigid discipline that governed military life. Goulart's government, fearing to alienate a potential ally in the working class base of the Navy, handled the situation softly. The rebels were not harshly punished. Some were amnestied. 4 senior military officers. That was the final straw. In the military hierarchy, discipline is not a rule. It is the foundation, the thing everything else is built on. When Goulart's government appeared to validate insubordination, to treat a military rebellion as a labor dispute rather than a breach of command, it sent a message that officers heard clearly. This government does not understand what the military is. This government cannot be trusted to protect the institution. This government must go. The decision that had been discussed in whispers for months was now being discussed openly, and a date was being chosen. In politics, you can survive your enemies. What you cannot always survive is losing your allies. Through early 1964, Goulart watched as people who had once supported him quietly reposition themselves. Governors who had defended his right to govern began distancing themselves from his rhetoric. Congressional allies who had backed his reforms started calculating whether backing him was still worth the cost. Military officers who had been neutral began attending the meetings where intervention was being planned. The coalition that had brought Goulart to power was not collapsing all at once. It was dissolving piece by piece, slowly enough that no single moment felt decisive, fast enough that when you look back, you realize the floor had gone. Part of the tragedy of those weeks was what Goulart was being told. His closest advisors assured him that the military would not move, that the working class would rise in his defense, that the popular support he had built through years of labor politics would protect him if it came to that. Some of them believed it. Some of them wanted to believe it. Some of them knew better and said it anyway. The result was a president who did not fully understand how little time he had left. We have already seen the March 13th rally through the eyes of those who celebrated it. 300,000 people. The executive decrees signed on stage. The speech that left no room for ambiguity. Now see it through the other eyes. For the military officers who watched on television, it was not a demonstration of popular support. It was a threat. A president surrounded by union leaders, signing decrees that bypass Congress. A president calling the Constitution inadequate. A president who seemed to believe he could govern by mobilizing the street, rather than by working through institutions. They had seen this before, or thought they had. Cuba, Venezuela, the template of a left-wing government that consolidated power by going around the rules, rather than through them. Whether that reading was accurate is something historians still debate. What is not in dispute is what happened next. The last week of March 1964 moved like a storm that everyone could see, but no one can outrun. Rumors filled the newspapers. Politicians made speeches about crises that felt increasingly abstract compared to what was actually being decided. In closed rooms, Goulart's supporters called for resistance. His opponents called for action. The middle, what was left of it, called for calm. No one was listening to the middle. In the barracks, the planning was complete. General Olímpio Mourão Filho, commanding the 4th Military Region in Minas Gerais, had decided he would not wait for a coordinated national signal. He would move and trust that others would follow. On the night of March 31st, his troops began to advance toward Rio de Janeiro. The clock had run out. In the final hours of March 1964, Brazil was holding its breath, not because people knew what was coming. Most of them didn't. But because after months of escalation, the marches, the countermarches, the rallies, the rebellions, the speeches that kept raising the stakes, something in the air had changed. The arguments had stopped. The noise had stopped. Even the radio seemed quieter. In the barracks of Minas Gerais, engines were starting. In the presidential palace, aides were waking Goulart with news they could barely form into sentences. In Washington, the naval task force was in position, and in the streets of Brazilian cities, ordinary people went to sleep, not knowing that when they woke up, their country would have a different name for what it was. In 1964, Brazil had no consensus, no shared trust, no common language for its disagreements. It had fear. It had hope. It had two visions of the future that could not coexist. For months, the country had walked toward the edge of something, slowly at first, then faster, then without being able to stop. Now it was there. Next episode, March 31st, 1964. The troops move. Goulart makes his final decisions. And the military dictatorship that will govern Brazil for the next 21 years begins.